Donald Trump's renewed threat to invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy National Guard troops domestically is a move that has sent shockwaves across the political spectrum and reignited one of the most divisive debates in modern American history. The Insurrection Act, an 1807 law that allows a president to use military forces within the United States to suppress civil disorder, rebellion, or insurrection, has rarely been used and always under extreme circumstances. For Trump to signal its use again, especially amid political tensions and nationwide protests, suggests not only a potential misuse of executive power but also a dangerous normalization of authoritarian tendencies in the American political system. This threat reflects the deep political polarization that defines the current era, as well as a broader erosion of democratic norms that once acted as guardrails against the overreach of power. What makes Trump's statement particularly alarming is not just its content but its timing and tone. It was less a legal declaration and more a political message, aimed at consolidating his image as a law and order leader willing to take aggressive action against dissent, regardless of the consequences for democracy. The Insurrection Act is not a casual political tool. Historically, it has been invoked in moments of extreme national crisis, such as during the Civil Rights era when President Eisenhower sent troops to enforce desegregation in Little Rock, or during the 1992 Los Angeles riots when President George H.W. Bush acted to restore order after widespread violence. In those cases, its use was carefully balanced with constitutional oversight and grounded in a legitimate threat to public safety. Trump's threat, however, appears less about responding to genuine insurrection and more about projecting strength in the face of criticism and opposition. It plays into a narrative he has cultivated for years, of an embattled leader surrounded by chaos, positioning himself as the only figure capable of restoring order. This narrative resonates deeply with a certain segment of his supporters who view the state of the nation as one of decline and disorder, but it also raises a chilling question: what happens when the military becomes a political instrument rather than a neutral protector of the Constitution? Political observers and legal scholars have repeatedly warned that invoking the Insurrection Act under vague or politically motivated pretenses risks eroding civil liberties. The deployment of military forces within U.S. borders blurs the line between civilian governance and martial authority, creating an atmosphere of fear and suppression rather than stability. The Founding Fathers designed a clear separation between military and civilian control for a reason. They understood that once the military is used to control domestic dissent, democracy itself is endangered. Trump's threat, therefore, must be understood not as an isolated political statement but as part of a broader pattern in which power is exercised not through persuasion or consensus but through intimidation and force. In doing so, he effectively challenges the traditional boundaries of executive restraint and tests how far his base, and the political system, will allow him to go. Underlying Trump's posture is also a deeper socio-political divide. America today is more fragmented than it has been in generations, with partisan loyalties replacing national unity and ideological identity overriding shared values. Trump's rhetoric, often charged with emotional appeal and confrontation, feeds off this polarization. When he speaks of domestic enemies, or lawless mobs, his audience understands that he is not merely referring to criminals but to anyone who challenges his authority or ideology. This framing transforms legitimate protest and dissent, cornerstones of a healthy democracy, into acts of rebellion deserving military intervention. The danger lies not only in what Trump says but in how it reshapes public perception. When citizens begin to see political opposition as an existential threat rather than a democratic right, the foundation of the republic begins to crumble. The threat to invoke the Insurrection Act also reflects a breakdown of trust between government institutions and the people. In a functional democracy, order is maintained not through fear but through legitimacy, the belief that laws and policies are fair, accountable, and representative of the public's will. When that legitimacy erodes, as it has under years of partisan division, leaders may be tempted to rely on coercion rather than cooperation. Trump's use of inflammatory language, framing protesters as anarchists or traitors, serves to justify extreme measures. It becomes a self-fulfilling cycle: fear is stoked to justify force, and force then deepens fear. This cycle weakens public faith in democratic systems and fuels resentment, making reconciliation even more difficult. The fact that Trump is once again reaching for such rhetoric suggests a political strategy rooted not in governance but in division, a means of rallying his base by portraying himself as the last bulwark against chaos. The invocation of the Insurrection Act would also have profound implications for the military itself. America's armed forces are trained and structured to defend the nation from external threats, not to police its own citizens. Using them in domestic conflicts places soldiers in morally and legally precarious positions, forcing them to act against fellow Americans in politically charged situations. Military leaders have historically resisted such involvement, aware that their institution's legitimacy depends on remaining above partisan politics. When Trump previously hinted at deploying troops during national protests, top Pentagon officials expressed discomfort, emphasizing that the military should not be used as a tool for political gain. Yet, even the threat of such deployment exerts pressure on the institution, testing its independence and potentially damaging its credibility. If the Insurrection Act were to be used as a routine political instrument, the trust between the armed forces and the public would be irreparably harmed. At its core, Trump's renewed threat is not only a challenge to political norms but to the moral fabric of American democracy. The ability to protest, to question authority, and to demand justice are not acts of insurrection, they are acts of citizenship. The Insurrection Act was meant to protect the nation from violent rebellion, not to suppress democratic expression. By suggesting its use in response to political opposition, Trump blurs this distinction and sets a precedent that future leaders could exploit. The long-term consequence of such rhetoric is a gradual shift toward authoritarian governance, where dissent is criminalized and power becomes concentrated in the hands of one leader. In this sense, Trump's statement is more than a political maneuver, it is a reflection of a larger ideological struggle over what kind of country America wants to be, one that governs through consent or one that rules through control. The broader implication of Trump's threat is that it exposes how fragile democratic norms have become. Once considered unthinkable, the idea of deploying the military against citizens is now openly discussed on national platforms, debated not as a moral question but as a political tactic. This normalization of extreme measures is itself a symptom of democratic decay. What was once a warning sign has become a campaign message. Trump's confidence in making such threats publicly also demonstrates how the political environment has evolved to accommodate, and even reward, defiance of institutional limits. The silence or complicity of other political figures in response to these threats only emboldens this trend. Without strong opposition from both political parties, actions once viewed as unconstitutional or authoritarian may soon become standard practice, pushing the nation further away from its founding principles. In this light, Trump's invocation of the Insurrection Act represents far more than a momentary political controversy, it is a lens through which to view the current state of American democracy. It forces the country to confront whether the institutions designed to safeguard liberty can withstand the pressures of populism, polarization, and power. The Insurrection Act, once a measure of last resort, now stands as a symbol of how easily legal authority can be weaponized when political ambition eclipses democratic restraint. The Insurrection Act, one of the oldest laws in American history, was never meant to serve as a political weapon, yet its recent invocation in national discourse by Donald Trump has transformed it into precisely that. Historically reserved for extraordinary circumstances such as violent uprisings, mass riots, or complete breakdowns of civil authority, the Insurrection Act was designed to protect the integrity of the Union during times of existential crisis. But in Trump's rhetoric, it has been reframed as a tool of political convenience, a mechanism to display dominance and control rather than restore order. The significance of this shift cannot be overstated, as it reflects a growing trend in which executive power is interpreted not as a constitutional duty but as a personal instrument of enforcement. When leaders threaten to use the military against their own citizens to silence dissent or to reinforce a political message, it marks a dangerous departure from the foundational principles of democracy and civil liberty. Throughout American history, the Insurrection Act has been invoked sparingly and with deep reluctance. It was used during the Reconstruction era to suppress the Ku Klux Klan's violent insurgency, during the desegregation crises of the 1950s and 1960s to enforce civil rights, and in 1992 to quell the riots in Los Angeles. In each case, it was deployed in response to chaos that threatened the very stability of the nation, and it was done with the understanding that such power carried immense risks. Presidents recognized that the use of federal troops on domestic soil could easily blur the line between public safety and state oppression. What makes Trump's invocation of this law so controversial is not just the threat itself, but the context in which it is made, a time when protest, civil disobedience, and political expression are being portrayed as enemies of the state rather than components of democratic life. By suggesting that peaceful demonstrations or localized unrest warrant military intervention, Trump redefines dissent as rebellion and governance as domination. The reimagining of the Insurrection Act as a political tool has serious implications for civil liberties. The act was never meant to replace civilian law enforcement or to serve as a means of suppressing political opposition. Yet under Trump's framing, it becomes a blunt instrument to silence critics and maintain control through intimidation. Civil rights advocates warn that deploying troops domestically risks escalating tensions rather than resolving them. Soldiers are trained for combat, not crowd control or community engagement, and their presence in American streets would send a chilling message to the public, that the government no longer trusts its people and views them as potential threats. This militarization of civic life transforms the relationship between citizens and the state, undermining the idea that government exists to serve and protect, not to command and discipline. Once the public becomes accustomed to seeing the military in domestic affairs, the threshold for its use lowers, creating a dangerous precedent for future leaders. Trump's rhetoric surrounding the Insurrection Act also reflects a broader effort to politicize fear. By framing protests, particularly those related to racial justice or opposition to his administration, as acts of insurrection, he taps into deep anxieties among certain segments of the population who feel that social change has moved too far, too fast. He presents himself as the last line of defense against chaos, casting dissenters as enemies of order. This narrative allows him to justify authoritarian measures under the guise of security. It's a classic political tactic, to manufacture a sense of crisis so that extraordinary powers appear necessary. The more fear spreads, the easier it becomes to convince the public that military intervention is a reasonable response. This manipulation of fear for political gain erodes the very trust that sustains democratic society, replacing dialogue and compromise with division and coercion. The framing of the Insurrection Act as a political weapon also exposes the fragility of America's checks and balances. The Constitution grants Congress oversight over the executive branch, yet when leaders invoke emergency powers, that oversight often weakens. The public, too, becomes desensitized to the idea that extraordinary authority can be exercised without accountability. Trump's threat highlights how easily laws designed for protection can be twisted into tools of repression when placed in the wrong hands. The danger lies not only in the potential for immediate misuse but in the precedent it sets. Future presidents may be emboldened to use the Insurrection Act not as a last resort but as a first response to domestic opposition. Once such norms are broken, they are difficult to restore, and what was once unthinkable becomes routine. In the broader context of American history, the transformation of the Insurrection Act into a political instrument echoes the tactics of regimes that equate dissent with disloyalty. The strength of a democracy lies not in the uniformity of its citizens but in their freedom to disagree without fear of punishment. When that freedom is threatened by the very institution meant to protect it, the moral authority of the state collapses. Trump's suggestion to use the Insurrection Act domestically sends a signal that the government may no longer distinguish between legitimate protest and insurrection. This blurring of categories serves political expediency but undermines the rule of law. The power of the state, once used to silence opposition, rarely retreats voluntarily. It grows, adapts, and embeds itself deeper into the fabric of governance, turning temporary measures into permanent realities. There is also a symbolic dimension to Trump's threat. The image of troops patrolling American cities, confronting citizens exercising their right to protest, would not only erode domestic trust but also damage the country's reputation abroad. The United States has long portrayed itself as a beacon of freedom and democratic values. Deploying the military against its own people would contradict that image and weaken its moral standing on the global stage. Authoritarian regimes would seize on the opportunity to label American democracy as hypocritical, while domestic critics would see it as the ultimate betrayal of the nation's founding ideals. The optics of such an act would be devastating, not only politically but culturally, reinforcing divisions that could take generations to heal. At the heart of this issue is a philosophical struggle between two competing visions of governance, one rooted in democratic accountability and another in centralized authority. The use of the Insurrection Act as a political tool signals a shift toward the latter, where control becomes more important than consent. In this model, the government's legitimacy no longer derives from the people's trust but from its ability to enforce compliance. The fear that motivates such governance is self-perpetuating. The more the state relies on force, the more it alienates its citizens, and the more force becomes necessary to maintain control. This is not the path of a healthy democracy but of a system losing faith in its own people. Legal scholars have noted that the ambiguity of the Insurrection Act makes it especially vulnerable to abuse. It grants the president broad discretion to determine what constitutes an insurrection, leaving room for subjective interpretation. In the wrong context, this discretion can be weaponized to justify actions that would otherwise violate constitutional rights. The lack of clear judicial or congressional oversight compounds the risk. Trump's willingness to invoke such a law, not in response. This distortion of civic responsibility into hostility changes how Americans perceive their own role in governance. Rather than being empowered participants in democracy, they risk becoming subjects of surveillance and control, wary of expressing dissent for fear of reprisal. The transformation of the Insurrection Act from a shield into a sword illustrates a broader truth about power. Once expanded, it rarely contracts. What begins as a threat today may become policy tomorrow, and each time the boundaries of authority stretch, the space for freedom narrows. The political use of the Insurrection Act not only endangers civil liberties in the present but also sets a precedent that future administrations may exploit, regardless of ideology. When the machinery of democracy is repurposed for domination, the line between lawful governance and tyranny becomes almost invisible. The threat by Donald Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act and deploy National Guard troops domestically exposes a deep and growing tension between law enforcement and civil freedom, one that strikes at the very heart of what it means to live in a democracy. It raises uncomfortable questions about whether the pursuit of law and order can coexist with the preservation of liberty, or whether the two are now locked in a battle for dominance. For decades, Americans have relied on the principle that the government exists to protect both safety and freedom in equal measure, but that balance appears to be eroding. Trump's rhetoric, which paints protests and dissent as threats to national stability, suggests that the scales are tipping toward control over consent, power over participation. The idea that the government might use military force to suppress political expression reveals how fragile the boundary between democratic governance and authoritarianism has become in the United States. At the core of this tension is a fundamental misunderstanding, or perhaps a deliberate distortion, of what law and order truly means. In a democracy, the rule of law is meant to safeguard rights, not suppress them. It is supposed to provide structure for freedom, not restrict it. Yet, Trump's repeated emphasis on enforcing order through strength, discipline, and punishment redefines the concept in authoritarian terms. His threats to use the Insurrection Act mirror a philosophy that views dissent as chaos and resistance as rebellion. Under this worldview, protests, particularly those driven by demands for justice or equality, are not expressions of democracy but acts of disobedience requiring a show of force. This inversion of meaning transforms the government from a guardian of liberty into an instrument of suppression. It's a subtle but powerful shift that reframes citizenship itself, not as a right to be exercised freely, but as a behavior to be managed and controlled. The history of law enforcement in America reveals that the line between protection and repression has always been contested. The Insurrection Act, passed in 1807, was originally intended to ensure that the federal government could intervene when states failed to uphold constitutional order. Yet, it was also a product of an era deeply marked by slavery, rebellion, and fear of unrest. Over time, it has been used both to advance justice and to entrench oppression. During the Civil Rights era, it was invoked to protect black students entering desegregated schools, but it was also used to quell urban uprisings where communities demanded fair treatment. This dual legacy underscores the inherent danger in granting leaders unchecked discretion over when and how to deploy force. In the hands of a president who sees himself as embattled and persecuted, the act becomes less a tool for stability and more a weapon of control. Trump's invocation of the Insurrection Act as a political threat, therefore, is not just a legal or procedural issue, it is a moral and constitutional one. What makes Trump's threat particularly significant is how it reflects and amplifies the polarization of the current political climate. The notion of deploying troops against citizens is not simply about maintaining peace, it's about signaling to his supporters that he is willing to go further than anyone else to defend their version of America. This kind of rhetoric deepens divisions, creating an us versus them dynamic that undermines any sense of shared national identity. Those who protest are cast not as fellow citizens exercising democratic rights, but as enemies of order. Law enforcement, in turn, is encouraged to see itself as the front line in a war against domestic opposition. This mentality corrodes the principles of justice and equality that underpin the rule of law. When police and military power become instruments of political will rather than public service, the line between democracy and dictatorship begins to blur. The potential consequences of such a shift are profound. If military force is normalized as a response to domestic dissent, the chilling effect on free speech and assembly would be immediate. People would think twice before marching, speaking out, or organizing for fear of being labeled insurgents or traitors. The First Amendment, long considered the bedrock of American democracy, would be rendered meaningless in practice if its exercise carries the risk of state violence. Moreover, the use of the military in domestic affairs would fundamentally alter the relationship between the governed and those who govern. The social contract, the implicit agreement that citizens obey laws in exchange for protection of their rights, depends on trust. Once that trust is broken by the sight of soldiers patrolling city streets or suppressing protests, it becomes nearly impossible to rebuild. Trump's threat also exposes the fragility of the institutions meant to constrain executive power. The judiciary, Congress, and state governments serve as checks on the presidency, but their ability to act depends on political will and public support. When a significant portion of the population views strongman tactics as legitimate or necessary, those institutions are weakened. Trump's rhetoric resonates with individuals who equate freedom with security, who see order as a moral good regardless of the cost. This mindset allows for the gradual erosion of democratic norms without immediate backlash. The danger is not only in the potential deployment of troops but in the normalization of such threats as an acceptable part of political discourse. Each time a leader uses the language of force to address dissent, it becomes a little less shocking, a little more expected, and the democratic fabric unravels a little further. The tension between law enforcement and civil freedom is also reflected in the cultural polarization that defines modern America. For some, the sight of troops or heavily armed police represents safety and strength. For others, it symbolizes oppression and fear. These competing narratives make consensus nearly impossible. When a leader like Trump weaponizes this division, he turns citizens against each other, ensuring that calls for unity or reform are drowned out by mutual suspicion. The rhetoric of restoring order becomes a political brand, one that thrives on conflict rather than resolution. It's a strategy that keeps power consolidated at the top by keeping the people divided below. The louder the outcry for justice becomes, the more justification he finds to tighten control. The broader philosophical question underlying this conflict is whether democracy can survive when its mechanisms are used to undermine it. Laws designed to protect order can become instruments of repression if wielded without restraint. The Insurrection Act, in this context, serves as both a symbol and a warning. It symbolizes the immense power the executive holds, and it warns of how easily that power can be misused when the distinction between enforcing peace and enforcing conformity disappears. When the government begins to see its citizens as adversaries, every protest becomes a battlefield, every critic a potential enemy, and every call for accountability an act of defiance. Trump's use of the language of law and order appeals to a historical pattern deeply embedded in American politics, the idea that strong leadership requires decisive action, even at the expense of liberty. This narrative has always been seductive during times of crisis. It promises stability and security but demands obedience in return. What makes it so dangerous is that it cloaks authoritarian impulses in the language of patriotism. By framing suppression as protection, it becomes easier to justify extreme measures.